Whether you're a mom who longs to talk to her kids about Jesus but doesn't know how, a church leader who wants to teach your families to take their faith personally, or simply someone who wants to see the church flourish in these trying times, the D6 Conference has the tools for you. Coming to Orlando and Seattle in 2025, with over 50 breakout sessions and presentations from Christian thought leaders, you'll walk away with fresh ideas, new perspectives, and a renewed passion for your ministry. At D6, we don't just talk about discipleship, we provide practical tools for you to turn these desires into actions. To register or learn more, follow the link in the description or visit d6conference.com.
Welcome back to the D6 Family Ministry Podcast. We believe that discipleship should not be difficult, so we're here to help you connect the dots between the church and home. Together, let's guide each generation, whether related to you or not, to stand confident in their faith. I'm your host, Ron Hunter, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Marianne Howard. Hello, Marianne.
Hello, Ron. Okay, so today we are going to get filled full of information and data and interesting insights about Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And I wanted to ask you, so we work on a team that has 4 different generations represented, 3 or 4 different generations represented. And I love that. And it's got its own unique things to it. Like, we're learning a lot from each other. So I would love to know your observation of how Gen Z, Gen X, millennials, and even Gen Alpha, like more Gen, we're at Gen Z is the workforce age.
Right.
So
That's right.
What are your observations about the different generations and how we interact?
Well, I think if we're going to minister across all generations, we've got to get outside of our own preferences. And I would summarize it this way. We can either allow tension or we can allow teaching, and you have to choose which one it's going to be. I love hearing the perspective of other people. It reminds me so much of what I'm missing in my own blind spots.
That's good.
At the end of the day, once you listen, you can then have a conversation about it, and I believe reach a right conclusion. And it doesn't have to be your own conclusion. And I love our multi-generational team. There's a ton of creativity and a ton of wisdom on there, regardless of chronological age.
That's right.
What's your thoughts in on that?
I'm learning a lot. And just like you said, it's the blind spots. And it's like, I'm trying to put myself, there's differences, and we've not had conflict, but we've not all agreed on things.
Yes.
And that's just an honest thing. And I think it's healthy that we don't all agree, but we're all coming at it from a different angle. And, oftentimes you're going to have to be the decision maker between several different generations. At the end of the day, a decision has to be made. But I also love putting myself in someone else's mindset. How did they come up with that decision, or how did they come up with that choice? That's helping me think bigger and broader. And just like you said, it really does emphasize and enforce humility, because we've got to stay teachable.
Yes.
So,
Speaking of thinking differently, Ben Birdsong is going to really help stretch our minds around the multi-generation. And by the way, this topic is popping up quite a bit. It always has been, but there's more and more people paying attention. And I think that back when we were first introduced to the millennial generation, which was very different from previous generations, churches did not adapt quickly enough. Now I think we're paying attention. But if we're going to think differently, let's have a brief glimpse at what they're going to hear in this episode with this quote from Ben Birdsong.
The only way we can begin to address the issues faced by Generation Z or Gen Alpha is to fall in love with the students we actually teach, lead, coach, and parent, not the ones we wish we had, because they're products of our own making.
And just to come behind that with Ron's great words, let's pay attention. As you listen to this episode, I want to encourage you to get a pen and paper and evaluate and see if there's something new that you can learn about Gen Z and Gen Alpha. Let's have a listen.
Today's guest is Dr. Ben Birdsong. Dr. Birdsong is the chief creative for Your Youth Ministry Curriculum, a company that creates custom youth ministry content for churches. Ben served in parachurch and local church ministry for 12 years and now seeks to help churches and ministries with custom curriculum development. Ben is also an adjunct professor at Birmingham Theological Seminary, teaching in family ministry. It's so good to have you here at D6.
So great to be here. It's been a wonderful time. Wonderful experience.
I haven't met you before.
No, this is our first time to meet.
I love it. I love meeting new people. I love making sure that D6 is getting fresh ideas from people. And so I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Welcome.
Me too. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm a researcher by trade, so let's talk research today,
Yes.
if that's okay. What are some of the most recent research studies saying about the different generations at this point in society?
Yeah, for sure. Well, when we think about generational research, I think it's important for us to realize that what they're doing is based on a lot of stereotyping. So as we're approaching this, I know that we learn things from stereotypes, but we're also concerned when we get to be the one that stereotypes.
Right,
So
yeah.
as we're journeying into that, I think that's something to consider. So as we think about Gen Z and Gen Alpha, there were two resources that really stood out to me as really helpful for those who are wanting to get started. So one is a book called Generation Z Unfiltered by Tim Elmore and Andrew McPeak. And it walks through what Gen Z looks like and how us as pastors and ministers and parents can engage with that. And when we think about Generation Alpha, a lot of the research for Gen Alpha is coming out of Australia. And so it's interesting that the Aussies are ahead of us in the next generation. And one resource there that's really helpful is a book called Generation Alpha by Mark McCrindle and Ashley Fell. And so when we think about the two generations that we have as parents or in our ministries and children or youth ministry, we've got Gen Z, which was born between 1997 and 2010, and Gen Alpha, which is 2010, and the rest of them will be born this year in 2024. And so when we think about those generations, some characteristics that kind of stand out from those. So some characteristics of Gen Z that Tim Elmore helped put together in his book that I wanted to share with you are this. So they're independent yet dependent on parents. So their whole world is a desire to be independent, yet they're so dependent on parents for everything and continue to run back to those things. Gen Z is also trendy, yet traditional in practice. They want to do things that are on the cutting edge, yet a lot of their values and practices tend to be more traditional. They're both often alone, yet never alone. When we think about technology and we think about cell phones and the fact that they're always connected and always plugged in, they're often alone, but they're never completely alone. They have life so good. Us as adults look at teenagers and kids and Gen Z specifically and go, y'all have got life really good, but for you, life seems very hard and overwhelming. And so they see have life so good, yet it's so difficult. They experience virtually no dramatic moments, yet they feel like there's so much drama. They're very concerned about the world and everything going on, and the things that they experience seem so huge to them. That leads to anxiety and the concerns we see in the next generation. They're cognitively advanced, yet emotionally behind. They are, in their mind, continuing to grow, yet their emotions haven't caught up to what they're learning there. They live an authentic life, a life seeking authenticity, but also artificial. You think about the desire for being social media stars, the desire to curate and create their world in the way they desire to be. And their world is very easy that a lot of us would say from the outside, but they see it as very hard. And so Gen Z, when we think about our teenagers right now and our college students, those are some things that kind of help define them. When we think about Gen Alpha, our oldest Gen Alphas now would be coming into middle school. And when we think about Generation Alpha, it's hard to gauge a lot of things about the younger generation because, like, what elementary kid are you going to be able to ask about their purchasing habits and their views on geopolitical issues and things like that that kind of help define a generation. And so when we think about Generation Alpha, one thing that Mark McCrindle said about it that I thought was helpful in his book, he said that they're predicting that Generation Alpha are going to be up-agers in many ways. They're going to come through physical maturity earlier than previous generations. Adolescence for them will begin even earlier and will last longer than any previous generation.
Oh, heaven help us.
Yes, that's going to be a challenge for sure.
I've got 3 of them, man. I've got 3.
For sure. And what's interesting about that, we were talking about this in my breakout session earlier, and we got to the Q&A point, and one of the ladies in the class raised her hand and said, I have an interesting point to point out with this. As we think about D6 and as we think about trying to disciple in our home, this is a positive because it gives us more time to invest in our kids. Mm-hmm. And so I'd not thought about it and framed it that way because, normally we frame it of like, you haven't launched. Mm-hmm. How can we help you launch versus God is strategically placing you maybe here for a longer time frame. So I thought that was really, really neat. Mm-hmm. They're predicting this generation will stay in education longer, start their earning years later, and will likely stay home with their parents more than any other generation. And so the role of parents, therefore, spans a wider range. Still housing and founding their adult children, Alpha will continue this trend. And so you think about the things we're seeing in Gen Z or what they're predicting will also connect to Gen Alpha. Mm-hmm. Some characteristics that the early research out of Australia talks about for Gen Alpha is that they're going to be digital. They're going to be surrounded by technology. We think about Gen Z was surrounded by smartphone technology. The shift we have with Gen Alpha is the technology they're surrounded by is smart technology. Mm-hmm. I have a 3-year-old nephew, and he can talk to Siri and talk to Alexa, and all kinds of things can happen because of that. So you have this generation that's growing up with tech, not just on their phone, but tech everywhere around them, helping define their world. They're going to be social. They'll be socially connected and shaped by their peers. They'll be global. They'll be more aware of what's going on in the world as the world shrinks and as we can watch, even when we think about things this year, the wars that are happening around the world are unfolding on our phones. Mm-hmm. And so they'll feel more global and more connected to the world. They'll be more mobile. They'll have more flexibility. We see the pandemic and we see the reconstruction after the pandemic making the world more mobile when it comes to work and working remote and all those kind of things. And they're visual. They want to see information visually. So that's some early characteristics we're seeing coming out of the research out of Australia on Gen Alpha.
So with all of the differences, and this is just 2 generations
that
we're talking
This
about,
is 2 generations,
right?
yes.
But with all of the differences that you just mentioned, even just in those 2 generations, it sounds like ministry has to look different from one generation to the next. Is that accurate?
It does. Ministry does have to look different from one generation to the next. I think it's easy to think about that when we think about boomers versus alpha, but I think we miss it in the slight shifts that happen in generations between the different generations. So when we think about that as ministers, we need to be constantly trying to evaluate the next generation and trying to understand the kids that sit in front of us.
Yeah.
And realize that, these generational shifts we see are not necessarily happening at the same point in different parts of the country. And so to study the kids you have and to continue to be caught up on generational research is very important. And so we got to be changing our ministry approaches.
Yeah.
What we did in children's ministry and youth ministry 5 years, 10 years ago is not necessarily the right approach anymore.
Right.
And so, we need to hold strong to the truth of God's word and to our theology, but like our practical of how we do ministry needs to shift and needs to change as new generations come in.
Yeah, I'm thinking specifically about student ministry because, at that point of the, 2010 is, when Gen Alpha starts.
Right.
And those are middle schoolers. So a lot of student ministries have middle school and high school. Yep. And, sometimes college is lumped in there with under the student ministry umbrella.
Yeah.
Even within those age groups, ministry seems to need to look different.
It does need to look different. And one of the challenges I think we're going to see is when those groups mix together, when in high school or in middle school, when you have some Gen Zs and some Gen Alphas in the same room.
Right.
So, and what we see with generations too, the dates we have are arbitrary in some ways.
Yeah.
And so there may be some overlap. I don't know if I've had some people I've worked for before in my life and they were in a certain generation, but acted like the older generation.
Right.
And so, yeah. So I think how we compensate for that is we're trying to listen and we're trying to learn and we're trying to build things around the different generations, keeping characteristics in mind and keeping needs in mind.
Yeah.
So we're making sure that we're communicating the gospel and that we're discipling students and kids in a way that connects to them.
Yeah.
Because the goal is their transformation and the goal is them walking with Jesus and being a part of that process. And so just being intentional to see what that looks like and then to be willing to put have your methods and your approaches with an open hand while having your theology and views of Scripture in a closed hand. So I think those are some balances you're trying to have there.
Yeah. What about parents? Because that's literally me. I have both, you know, so obviously, I mean, it comes down to personalities too. You know,
Right.
my oldest has a completely different personality than the other three, which is very stereotypical. But, you know, I mean, really, like, he is in a different generation than the other three.
Right.
And so how do I parent them differently, you know, in regards to this, at least?
For sure. For sure. I know you'd parent them differently based on their personality and they're gifted anyway, but I think as a parent, it's important to understand the generational differences and look for ways to connect in those different ways and realizing the challenges of those. And I know that's what we're going to talk about in a few minutes, the challenges, and just knowing those challenges and being able to step into that, I think is important.
Right. Yeah, we'll talk about those challenges after this quick break. We'll be right back.
Let's face it, the reason why you're listening to this podcast is the daunting challenge of discipling the next generation. Many of us wonder if we're even equipped to lead young people in this faith journey. Discipleship is Leadership, the latest book from Dr. Rich Griffin, provides the tools and the insights you need to disciple children and youth in your home and ministry. Grounded in the most reliable psychosocial developmental theory available, this book offers practical guidance that's totally surrounded and undergirded with Scripture for parents, ministry leaders, and mentors alike. With real-life stories and biblical examples, Discipleship is Leadership simplifies the disciple-making process while empowering you to lead with confidence. If you're ready to disciple young lives through intentional leadership, grab your copy today. To purchase or learn more about Discipleship is Leadership, follow the link in the description.
And we're back with Dr. Ben Birdsong talking about the generations, right? Gen Z and Gen Alpha. Let's talk about some challenges. What challenges do you foresee church leaders, specifically ministry leaders, having when it comes to these two different generations?
For sure. So some challenges we think about with Gen Z. One thing we've seen happen is we've seen parenting shift. And the way parenting is shifted is for the millennials, a lot of parents, you may have heard the term a helicopter parent. A helicopter parent would have flown around above their kid, making sure everything was okay and just checking in. Well, for Gen Z, the shift has happened and parents have moved from the air to the ground. And what they call parents now is snowplow parents, or
I have not heard that one yet.
Snowplow or lawnmower parents. And so what that would look like is, so when your helicopter parent hovered above to see how everything was going, your snowplow or your lawnmower parent wants to clear the path for their kid. They want to have a place where there's no opposition, there's no challenge, and mom and dad are clearing the way for them. And so what that's created is that's created a generation that's fragile.
Yes,
a generation that doesn't know how to deal with conflict, to deal with challenge, and how to function in the real world. There's a quote I use in my breakout session, and it's from a book, and it's called Generation of Wimps. And that's really what that is created, where when there's no opposition and there's no challenge, you don't grow. You don't learn how to function in the world. And the thing about that is, as parents want to keep their kids from experiencing hard things. But we need hard things to grow. We need hard things to learn. And that's an important part of that process. So one challenge is this parenting approach. Another challenge is we see adolescence extended. And so adolescence is a newer concept in the last couple hundred years. And it's a liminal space that has been created between childhood and adulthood. And that liminal space, the longer it lasts, kids and students wonder how to define themselves and feel like they're in a place where they can coast. You know, I don't want to really be an adult, because an adult involves challenge, an adult involves responsibility. And honestly, being an adult's not that fun compared to as you look back on your childhood, you know, all the stuff about adulting. And I wish I could go back to high school and all those things. So there's that extended adolescence. Another thing we're seeing is changing adult norms. The way we view the world as adults and the world around us is beginning to shift. We see that with culture. We see that with anxiety. We see that with all different things that are changing in the world. Another challenge I think they have is technology. Technology is everywhere, and it's a constant issue. So like when we were kids, if we had an issue at school, that would have been something we would have been able to leave at school when we got on the bus to go home. But now with social media and all that, the stuff continues 24/7. My wife teaches middle school, and there'll be times when definitely, there'll be times when stuff happens on the weekend on social media and rolls into the classroom on Monday morning. And as a teacher, you're trying to figure out A, what happened, and B, how do you sort through the drama and the issues that were created? And so the technology there all the time. The other thing I think is a challenge for Gen Z, and will be a challenge for Gen Alpha as well, is we see Christianity changing in America. We're going into more of a post-Christian context. What we've seen happening in Europe and in Canada is starting to come to America. And when Christianity in America becomes post-Christian, the foundation that we think about of Christianity being the foundation of our culture begins to shift. And part of that shift is things that we think about, like David and Goliath, and basic biblical stories that might be a part of the greater cultural narrative begin to go away. And there's even less of a knowledge of biblical truth. And so in a post-Christian culture, that changes lots of things. I think that changes really how we minister and how we speak truth to the next generations, because it's easy for us to make assumptions that certain words like sanctification and justification and grace and what they mean without defining our terms. And not that students are dumb, or not that students don't want to understand or want to grow, but when we assume that this foundation is there that may not be there anymore, that really changes the way we minister and the way we pour into them. And so those are some Gen Z challenges. So how do we approach that as ministry leaders and parents? First, we're going to approach the next generation with frustration and sometimes judgment, because we'd rather them to be like us than trying to learn from them. We look at the generation and go, well, why can't you just be like me? Why can't this be like it was when I was a kid and all that, versus trying to seek to understand? Another challenge ministry leaders have is we talked about this earlier, we've assumed the same old processes work. And they may not. And then as ministry leaders, we're trying to help parents understand what parenting is doing to a generation. The snowplow, the lawnmower are things that need to be addressed. And that's hard because there's a tension there. And that's one of the things parents face. There's the tension between protecting your child from harm and preparing your child to deal with opposition and challenge and things that they'll face in the real world. And that's a line, and that's a tension all of us must walk. And I think that's a challenge for parents as well, is how do you move your kid towards that? Because ultimately the goal of parenting is that your kid function without you, and your kid follow Jesus without you. And those things are important as a part of that process. There's one quote I came across that I thought was really neat as we think about generations, and it's by Frank Martin. He used to be the basketball coach at the University of Southern California, and he said this: "You know what makes me sick to my stomach? When I hear grown people say that kids have changed. Kids haven't changed. Kids don't really know anything about anything. We've changed as adults. We demand less of our kids. We expect less from our kids. We make their lives easier instead of preparing them for what life is truly about. We're the ones who changed." So I think when we think about generations, we think about what have we as adults done to create an environment that a lot of these things have come out of.
I haven't thought about that, but that makes total sense. And you talking about like the snowplow parents and stuff. I mean, like you said, we're trying to prepare our kids to be able to function without us, right? And there's going to be hard times in the world ahead for them.
Definitely.
And so as a parent, we have to see that as an opportunity for them to struggle under our roof while we can struggle with them, right? And coach them through and disciple them through those moments. How can we as parents and church leaders love and lead these generations when we don't necessarily relate to them always, or don't understand them sometimes, but how can we do that well?
I think a lot of that is the heart and the approach towards them. There's one thing that Tim Elmore said in his book that I thought was really good in framing this, is he says this: the only way we can begin to address the issues faced by Generation Z or Gen Alpha is to fall in love with the students we actually teach, lead, coach, and parent, not the ones we wish we had, because they're products of our own making. So are we going to be people who seek to love them and seek to care about them and realize that there's a cost involved with that? There's a cost of learning. There's a cost of being willing to do new things. And there's a cost of trying different things to try to connect in the best way you can. And so when we think about loving and leading this generation, it's about the heart. Do we care? Do we love? And is that our driving force versus trying to cram our kids, whether they're kids in our home or kids at our church, in a box that we've built that we think, a kid should be?
Right. Yeah. So what do you think, just speaking to church leaders specifically, what do you think their role should be in the church as far as these two generations? What should church leaders look to plug them into, allow them to have a part in our churches and ministries then?
For sure. Just when you think about a new generation coming up, we're raising disciples. That is, I hate to talk about the kids as the future church. The kids are part of the church now.
That's right. They are.
And so how are we building them up and how are we allowing them to serve? And I think we should put them in any place we can.
Yeah.
I think they should have leadership. I think they should have ownership. I think they should be given opportunities to teach and lead when they're to that point. And we're equipping our kids in our ministry to function on their faith outside of our youth group and outside of our children's ministry. And the steps we need to take in that process is we need to give them that ownership and we need to give them space to try things. Their opportunity their first time to share their faith, maybe in the context of our youth group mission trip. And when that doesn't go the way they want it to, we're there to pick them up. Yeah. We're there to encourage them. And I think, there's opportunities for Gen Z to come in and teach Gen Alpha. I think about VBS type spaces are a great opportunity for that. Small group stuff with an older adult mentor is a great opportunity for that. I think wherever we can find the space, we need to be open-handed with our ministries in raising up the next generation and allowing them to lead and allowing them to step into their calling. Yeah. Because I don't know about you, when I've felt called to ministry is when I had the opportunity to serve.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I began to see that God could use someone like me. And our kids and our students need opportunities to be put in that space. Because in those moments when they are forced to take steps of faith, they see that God is faithful. They see that God is real. And they see that God is willing to use broken, messed up people like me and you to make a difference in the world.
Yeah, I love that.
So that's the heartbeat there.
Well, thank you, Ben, so much for this insight. It's been helpful even in understanding my own kids, and church dynamics as well. May we be the best avenue to disciple these generations and see them as tools to, like you said, not just be the church of tomorrow, but to empower them to be the church of today. Thanks for your insights.
Thank you so much.
I hope you were attaching names of the people you work with, the people that you minister to and around, and even placing your kids, if your kids are in that generation, your friends, and making sure that we're not hearing this as sterile, theoretical language, but that we're going, oh, and it should be this bump into this insight that you go, now I understand better. And that's our goal, is to seek understanding more than being understood. Mm-hmm. I think that's the beauty of what we've heard from Ben.
Absolutely. I love his statement of we need hard things to grow as he addressed different parenting styles. And I had a very wise mentor say to me recently, Marianne, your job is to keep them safe, not keep them from failure.
Yeah.
And it landed really hard on me, but that's exactly what he's saying, is that my kids are going to grow when they mess up. And when there's failure there, that's how they learn. That's how I learned. And so I just appreciate that challenge. I just want to encourage our listeners, listen to this one again. Yeah. He gave such good data and insight. This is worth a re-listen, and just pay attention to those in your ministry. He called us to this final thought: fall in love with the students we have, not the ones we wish we had. We need to just close on that thought. Let's love the ones that God has put in front of us. And, the grass is greener where we water it. And so I just want you to think about that this week. We hope you'll join us next week as we hear from Erin Warren, and she is going to talk to us about biblical literacy, and it is an outstanding interview. Thank you so much for listening. To learn more, visit d6family.com. We look forward to seeing you next week.